Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, what is the relationship between heroism and psychopathy? Now, to answer this question about heroism and its relationship to psychopathy, I'm going to be using two articles. I'm mostly relying on one of these, but both of them are really about the same subject matter. The first one is published in 2018 by Patton and colleagues, and the second one was also published in 2018 by Falkenbach and colleagues. And what's interesting is we have two articles here really about the same topic published in the same year. So neither article references the other. So first let's start with the concept of psychopathy. So psychopathy is really a paradox in terms of the traits that are encompassed in the definition. Now, oftentimes we see psychopathy divided into two factors, factor 1 and factor 2 traits. So there's this two-factor model, and sometimes we also see 3 and 4-factor models of psychopathy. So some of the traits we see associated with psychopathy would include superficial charm, low anxiety, grandiosity, antisocial behavior, low levels of empathy or lack of empathy, impulsivity, irresponsibility, and sensation seeking. Now we can think about these two factors I mentioned before as interpersonal emotional, that's one, and lifestyle behavioral, that's the other. So with factor 1 we see traits like that superficial charm and grandiosity. With factor 2 we see antisocial behaviors, that impulsivity, irresponsibility, and sensation seeking that I mentioned as well. So generally we think of factor 1 as being primary psychopathy and factor 2 as being secondary psychopathy. I talk about these constructs in a prior video. Now we can also look at psychopathy from a slightly different angle by using an instrument that's fairly popular to measure psychopathy, the Psychopathic Personality Inventory Revised. Here we see dimensions like fearless dominance, this would be physical fearlessness, stress immunity, and that superficial charm. This is usually considered adaptive. We also see self-centered impulsivity, this has the antisocial traits under it, and coldheartedness, which would be lack of empathy, lack of guilt, and lack of attachment to other people. So this brings me to the idea of successful psychopathy. This is a theory in the study of psychopathy, and this says that some of the traits associated with success really align with some of the traits we see with psychopathy, like narcissism, fearlessness, and sensation seeking. We know from studies on leadership, for example, that there are both pros and cons associated with psychopathic traits. On the positive side, we see strategic thinking, better communication skills, and high levels of conscientiousness. On the negative side, we see individuals who are poor team players and have dysfunctional management styles. So with the theory of successful psychopathy in mind, we take a look at the particular studies here related to psychopathy and heroism. One of the theories here is that the fearless dominance component of psychopathy specifically is related to heroism. And one of the advantages of the Patton and colleagues study is that it looks at the number of heroic acts. Now it does this by studying first responders. So the participants were recruited from the population of first responders, including EMTs, firefighters, members of the military, and police officers. There's a higher likelihood for individuals in these careers of engaging in heroic acts, so it makes sense they'd be a sample from this study. So what were the results when they compared first responders and the number of heroic acts to a control group? They found that both heroism and altruism were positively associated with narcissism, boldness, and sensation seeking, but also with interpersonal workplace deviance and workplace conduct problems. So what we really see here from this study is that there's a theory that antisocial and prosocial behaviors are opposite poles of the same dimension, but that doesn't seem to be the case. These results indicate that antisocial and prosocial behaviors relate in a more complex way. Now, a word of caution about these results, and this was made clear in both of these studies. This doesn't mean that first responders have psychopathy. That's not what's indicated by these results. It means that there are certain psychopathic traits that were more elevated in first responders. In the Patton study, there was a negative association between heroism, and coldheartedness, that lack of empathy and lack of guilt piece. So we really didn't observe many maladaptive traits in the first responders, but rather the more adaptive traits like boldness. The mystery left by this patent study is really that relationship between antisocial and prosocial behavior I mentioned before. Now, in terms of the Falkenbach study, some of the results were similar and some were different. This study didn't look at first responders the same way we saw in the patent study, but only at police recruits. And again, just like we saw with the patent study, it found that the police recruits did not meet the definition of classic psychopathy. So we saw the boldness trait represented. Again, that's considered adaptive, but not the maladaptive traits. One difference here is that the coldheartedness trait was found to be elevated in the police recruits, but there are a few reasons this could be the case. One reason is that coldheartedness, a lack of empathy specifically, may be adaptive for this line of work. It may be important to be able to distance oneself from emotions when working in violent and stressful situations. Another reason for this elevated level of coldheartedness could be that these police recruits recently had training that stressed emotional suppression. So that recent training could be reflected in these scores. Another important point when interpreting the results of these studies is that psychopathy is complex and dimensional. These are several traits that load together on this construct of psychopathy, but together they represent a paradox. We see adaptive traits and maladaptive traits. So somebody really isn't psychopathic or not psychopathic. It's all these particular levels on certain traits. So we really need more research to see how these different psychopathic traits are both helpful and harmful to specific populations. I hope you found this description of first responders, heroism, and psychopathy to be interesting. Thanks for watching.